Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a structured, really deep dive into what has to be one of the absolute most catastrophic conflicts in the entire history of Westeros. We're talking about the succession struggle between Queen Rhaenyra and her half-brother, King Aegon II, from 129 to 131 AC. That's after Aegon's conquest, for context. We're going to look specifically at the mechanics of this ruin. I mean, how exactly did a dynasty at the absolute peak of its power manage to just burn itself to the ground?
Okay, let's dive into this. It's a fascinating question, right? When you actually look at the historical record, the Targaryens weren't defeated by some foreign empire with superior weaponry. There was no grand external threat that came in and brought them low. The devastating truth here is that they lost their dragons to each other. The very weapons that built their entire dynasty were turned completely inward. The math on this is just devastating. At the start of the dance, the Targaryens commanded 20 living dragons. But by the end of this incredibly short, brutal war, you can literally count the surviving dragons on one hand. And we're talking about just a few wild or hidden beasts remaining at that. It brilliantly illustrates how a family that ruled through absolute airborne supremacy managed to completely dismantle its own foundation. 17. Just let that sink in. 17 incredibly powerful, near-mythical creatures were dead by the end of this war. So today we're going to trace the tragic arc of exactly how and why those 17 fell.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, erasing limits of war. Then, the sky becomes a battlefield, followed by a climax of annihilation. After that, we'll cover the Dragonpit Rebellion, chaos at Tumbleton, and finally, how the Age of Dragons ends. All right, starting us off with Section 1, erasing limits of war, or the spark of war.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how our sources actually differ on the opening strike. When young Lucerys Velaryon flew his dragon Arrax to Storm's End as an envoy, he was supposed to be protected by messenger's rights, period. In the television adaptation, his death above Shipbreaker Bay is framed as this horrific accident. The massive Vhagar kind of acts on her own, totally ignoring Prince Aemon's frantic commands. But if you look at the book, Fire and Blood, the text treats this as deliberate murder, with Aemon actively pursuing his nephew with pure lethal intent. But regardless of which version you lean toward, the result was exactly the same. The ancient boundary protecting envoys was completely destroyed.
And, well, this just sparked an unstoppable ripple effect. Queen Rhaenyra's Black faction answered through the assassin's blood and cheese, which resulted in the incredibly cruel murder of the innocent child Jaehaerys right in his bed, a son for a son. It basically proved that the war no longer had any boundaries whatsoever. No one was safe.
Moving right along to Section 2. The sky becomes a battlefield. Tactical escalation. So the conflict violently shifts out of the castle corridors and literally up into the clouds, with dragons being deployed essentially as tactical nuclear weapons. At the Battle of Rook's Rest, we see another fascinating divergence in our sources regarding military strategy. In the book, King Aegon II and Aemond execute a calculated, highly coordinated trap against the Blacks. In the show, it plays out way more chaotically, where Aemond actually seems willing to burn his own brother as collateral damage just to secure the win. But in both accounts, the ugly truth remains. The opposing Green faction won the battle, sure, but they paid a horrific physical price, leaving King Aegon II and his beautiful dragon, Sunfyre, burned, mangled, and forever altered. And the cost for the Black faction at Rook's Rest was equally devastating. Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys fell. Now, Meleys put up an incredibly fierce fight. I mean, she heavily injured Sunfyre and really stood her ground. But ultimately, she succumbed to a massive ambush from below by Vhagar. With this one single battle, the Blacks lost not just a powerful beast, but their most measured, experienced dragon rider. The tactical escalation just continued at a breakneck pace. Over at the Battle of the Gullet, naval warfare brings down Vermax and Stormcloud, costing Rhaenyra her really capable heir, Jaehaerys, which was an absolutely devastating blow to her diplomatic efforts. Meanwhile, back on Dragonstone, the wild, unclaimed dragon Grey Ghost is suddenly slaughtered by a deeply wounded, roaming Sunfyre. You can really see the dynasty's control rapidly accelerating toward total collapse as these losses just keep piling up. Which brings us to Section 3, a climax of annihilation, the ultimate vendetta. So Daemon Targaryen had been hunting Aemond for months. Aemond and Vhagar were the Green's most destructive force by far, just burning the Riverlands to ash. When they finally met above the God's Eye, Daemon didn't even try to win a standard aerial dogfight. Knowing his dragon Caraxes just couldn't match Vhagar's colossal size,
Daemon forced a catastrophic mid-air rabble. He sacrificed his dragon and himself, literally leaping saddle to plunge his sword, Dark Sister, directly through Aemon's blind eye as they plummeted toward the earth. The impact, quote, threw up a gout of water said to be as tall as Kingspire Tower at Harrenhal. Just let that poetic image sink in for a moment. In a single heartbeat, with one colossal impact, both factions' most formidable, dangerous figures wiped each other completely off the board in a military disaster of epic proportions. Section 4. The Dragonpit Rebellion and the Loss of Control.
So the crucial point is the sheer scale of this loss. It's staggering. Shrenos, Morgul, Teraxes, Dreamfyre, Syrax. 5 dragons lost in a single night. And get this, they weren't killed by enemy military commanders. They were slaughtered by a starving, terrified, religiously furious mob of everyday ordinary citizens wielding axes, spears, and torches inside the dragon pit.
This event violently broke Rhaenyra's illusion that she possessed any sort of absolute control over the city. In a moment of just brutal, tragic irony, her son, Prince Joffrey, fell to his death trying to ride Syrax to the rescue. And Syrax herself, unchained and totally free to flee, she instead descended onto the furious crowd and was physically torn apart by the mob. By the time the sun rose, Rhaenyra was completely broken. Okay, Section 5, Chaos at Tumbleton. Pure destruction. You know, Tumbleton wasn't even really a battle. It was a collision. First, Vermithor, who is massive and now completely riderless, just attacks blindly on the ground, destroying friend and foe alike. Then Adam of Hull, trying to prove his loyalty to the Black Cause, flies Seasmoke down into a battle that literally no one is directing, sacrificing himself and his dragon to stop Vermithor. Finally, the young dragon Tessarion is mortally wounded in the fray. This is a massive thematic shift. Think back to those calculated, deliberate rules of war we discussed at the very start. Now, dragons are dying from pure, absurd, riderless chaos. It's a bloody free-for-all on the ground, where the weapons of mass destruction have completely lost their guidance systems.
Finally, Section 6, The Age of Dragons ends, the final whimper.
By this point, almost everyone who mattered at the start of the war is already dead. Aegon II has taken Dragonstone and exacted this public, cruel vengeance upon Rhaenyra. What follows is a final, desperate scrap between Baela Targaryen's quick young dragon Moondancer and the crippled, mangled remains of Sunfyre. They basically destroy each other in a pointless final convulsion on the ground, ensuring neither beast would ever fly again. Sunfyre succumbs to his wounds, and Aegon II is actually poisoned by his own men shortly after. And this brilliantly illustrates how the tragedy of this conflict really comes down to the number 1. Out of the 20 dragons that began the war, after the shattered branches of House Targaryen were finally politically joined under Aegon III and Jaehaera, there was only one single hatchling, Morning, left alive in the court. The supreme power they had fought so bitterly to control was completely gone. Which leaves us with this final, honestly provocative thought. As we look back at the moral decay, the friendly fire, the mob violence, and the chaotic free-for-alls that define the dance, did the Targaryens ever truly have control over the dragons to begin with, or were they just temporarily holding the leash of their own destruction? Think about that as you reflect on this history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.